They dragged her from the altar. She was still wearing her crown, its gold twisted by trembling hands, its jewels smeared with blood. They didn't care. They tore her from the sanctuary where kings were anointed, where oaths were made before God. She screamed. They laughed. They beat her with the leg of a bench, wood splintering, bone cracking, until the silence of the chapel was no longer holy, but horrific. Then, they left her, broken, bleeding, tossed like refuse into the forest outside the palace. No burial, no prayers, no crown. This was not the fate of a traitor or a criminal. This was the fate of a queen. Her name was Gertrude of Merania, wife of King Andrew II of Hungary. She ruled beside him. She mothered a future king. She shared his bed and bore his children. And yet, her end came not from a foreign army, not from a rival queen, but from her own court. Hungarian nobles she had once dined with, plotted with, prayed with. They hunted her like a beast, because in their eyes, she was no longer royal. She was no longer a woman. She was a threat, a foreigner, a symbol of everything they hated, cloaked in silk and walking too close to the throne. But why? Why would an entire political class rise up to slaughter a queen, publicly, violently, and without shame? Why would her body be left to rot, denied the rites of burial, as if her very existence was poison? And how did the royal court, the king himself, respond with silence? Was she a manipulative foreign empress? A tyrant behind the throne? Or simply a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time with too much grace to survive the knives? This is not a tale of war or glory. This is a story of betrayal, of blood, of whispers that killed. And no, this is not a story you were taught in school. It has been erased from the chronicles, whitewashed by kings, buried beneath titles and saints. But history remembers, and tonight, so will you. Because what happened to Queen Gertrude of Merania is not just medieval cruelty. It is the anatomy of fear, of power unchecked, of what happens when a woman rises too high, too fast, and forgets who's waiting with the axe. They called her queen, but they killed her like an animal. She was born among peaks that touched the sky. The winds of the Bavarian Alps whispered through pine forests and monastery bells, carrying with them the promise of a life both sheltered and sacred. Gertrude of Merania, daughter of Berthold IV, Duke of Merania, entered the world not as a peasant girl, nor simply as a duchess. She was destined, shaped from birth to marry into crowns, not into comfort. Her childhood was a tapestry of silks and sermons. Raised partly in the Cistercian convents of Andex, Gertrude's earliest memories were cloaked in incense and Gregorian chants. Her tutors were monks, her nurses noblewomen. She learned to sew, to kneel, to smile politely, and listen silently. Obedience was her inheritance, grace her armor. But it wasn't just piety she learned. Behind the stone walls of cloisters and the velvet-draped halls of her father's court, Gertrude was also taught to read the ambitions of men, to know when a smile was genuine and when it was a veiled threat. She watched her older sister Agnes marry the King of France. She watched her younger sister Hedwig enter the service of the church, only to later be canonized as a saint. In the house of Merania, daughters were not born for themselves. They were vessels of power, of legacy, of foreign alliances. When Gertrude was barely a teenager, word came from the east. King Andrew II of Hungary, recently widowed, was seeking a new queen. His land was rich in gold, but torn by factions. He needed more than beauty. He needed loyalty. And above all, he needed a woman whose family would owe him everything. The choice was swift. Gertrude was sent east, not as a girl, but as an answer. The wedding took place with grandeur, as all royal weddings do. Candles lined the cathedral in Buda, smoke curling like ghosts into the vaulted heavens. Latin hymns echoed through the aisles as Gertrude stepped forward, no longer the daughter of a duke, but now Queen of Hungary. She was barely 15. Her veil was longer than her childhood had been, and yet, in that moment, she was radiant. Contemporary records described her as tall, graceful, and serene. She carried herself like a woman twice her age, not with arrogance, but with a kind of stillness, as if she had already made peace with the weight of the crown pressing against her skull. Andrew was older, by more than a decade. Rough-hewn, hardened by campaigns, his beard flecked with gray. He spoke little Latin, and she spoke no Hungarian. But politics rarely needs love, only allegiance. Still, in the first years, there was a quiet warmth between them. Gertrude gave birth to a son, Bela, who would one day be king. She accompanied Andrew on travels, presided over court ceremonies, distributed alms to the poor. She brought with her German customs, court music, letters from theologians and scholars. To some, she was a breath of alpine clarity in a foggy, fractious kingdom. To others, she was foreign, too polished, too proud. But Gertrude, perhaps blinded by the success of her sisters and the affection of her young son, did not yet hear the murmurs. She did not see the daggers behind the smiles of the Hungarian nobility. She still believed she could blend in, that the grace she brought from the mountains would settle like snow across the court, quiet, pure, unthreatening. And so, she invited her family to court. Her brothers, her cousins, her German advisors. She found them positions, high ones, bishops, generals, chancellors. It was not unusual. Queens had always secured favor for their kin. But Hungary was not Bavaria. The nobles there remembered blood feuds longer than they remembered kings. And they saw in Gertrude not a queen, but a foreign spider, spinning a web in their homeland. Still she smiled. Still she ruled with open hands and careful poise. She brought art, liturgy, and order. She sang with her ladies, walked barefoot in church on holy days, gave generously to Cistercian abbeys. There was warmth in her yet, moments of genuine peace. When her son climbed into her lap, or when a German hymn drifted down the corridors at dusk. In those moments, she was not a queen. She was simply Gertrude, a girl from the Alps who had found her place in a kingdom far from home. But peace is a fragile thing in royal courts, and no amount of prayer, no hymn from the mountains, could drown out the whisper that had begun to spread. She rules through the king. She gives Hungary to the Germans. She is not one of us. And as winter approached, the snow she brought from the Alps began to melt, revealing not purity, but the jagged rocks beneath. At first, the whispers were just that. Whispers, soft as moth wings against the palace tapestries. They floated between courtiers during feasts, passed behind goblets of honeyed wine, cloaked in polite laughter. But beneath the surface, the tone sharpened, and what began as jest soon hardened into judgment. Have you noticed how many Germans now sit on the royal council? Her brother was granted Kalocsa, without even speaking Hungarian. Tell me, Is it Andrew who rules, or the queen in his shadow? The nobles of Hungary had long tolerated foreign queens. Tolerance was politics. But Gertrude was different. She didn't just arrive. She embedded. Her kin filled the halls. Her language rang louder than Hungarian. And in her elegance, in her certainty, there was something they could not abide: control. Behind the silk-draped walls of the palace, Hungary's old families began to feel pushed aside. Decisions were made without them, edicts signed in unfamiliar script. Their ancient privileges, titles, lands, influence seemed to pass quietly into foreign hands. Gertrude, perhaps blinded by loyalty, didn't see the resentment coiling at her feet. One of the first cracks came with the appointment of her brother, Berthold, as Archbishop of Kalocsa, one of the highest spiritual offices in the kingdom. The appointment wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. Berthold was young, arrogant, and politically ambitious. He lacked the reverence expected of a cleric and wielded his position like a sword rather than a staff. And worst of all, he was a foreigner. For the Hungarian magnates, this was more than nepotism. It was sacrilege. It was an invasion, not of soldiers, but of signatures and seals. A slow bleed of sovereignty administered not on the battlefield, but at the altar. If she can give a bishop's staff to her brother, what will she give away next? The treasury? The throne? And so the whispers grew louder. They spoke of treason, not in the legal sense, but in the deeper, older language of blood and soil. The idea that Hungary was being hollowed out, its heart carved and replaced with something foreign, something cold. Some accused her of spying for the German emperor. Others claimed she mocked local customs, that she scorned the Magyar nobility behind closed doors. None of it could be proven, but truth no longer mattered. In royal courts, perception is power, and Gertrude was beginning to lose both. King Andrew II, meanwhile, was often absent. Consumed by his campaigns in Galicia and ambitions for a crusade, he spent months at a time away from court. In his absence, Gertrude ruled, not in name but in practice. She presided over councils. She signed decrees. She approved land grants. She negotiated marriages, issued pardons, and redirected funds toward her family's abbeys. She was efficient. She was composed. But the more she led, the more alone she became. The men around her watched with clenched jaws. They saw not a queen preserving the realm, but a woman overstepping. Occupying space meant for kings, for warriors, for men. And so the accusations began to fester. She is greedy. She is a tyrant in silk. She seduces with charity, then steals behind cloistered doors. The court grew colder. Allies withdrew. Even servants seemed to bow a little lower, but linger less. Gertrude, for all her grace, began to retreat. She took solace in the monastery gardens, walked alone in the early mornings when a fog blanketed the Danube like a winding sheet. She wrote letters to her sisters, one now, Saint Hedwig, the other disgraced from France, and she prayed. Perhaps she knew the tides had turned. Perhaps she believed that prayer, like diplomacy, could cool a rising flame. But power doesn't yield to prayer. And in Hungary's court, the flame was already licking at the walls. Still, not all hated her. To the common folk in Buda, Gertrude was seen as generous. She commissioned roads, she funded hospitals, she gave alms openly. Some called her the White Swan, a reference to her calm beauty and foreign origin. But even that nickname was laced with unease. Because in Hungary, swans were not native birds. They arrived from elsewhere. They were graceful, but always passing through. Inside the palace, an uneasiness settled. Every smile became suspect, every feast a theater, every act of charity a gambit. Gertrude kept walking the halls, kept holding her son in her arms, kept whispering to her ladies-in-waiting in German, unbothered by the staring nobles who couldn't understand. But they understood enough. They saw her ruling without fear, and they mistook it for arrogance. They saw her grace, and they mistook it for weakness. She had come from the Alps as a bride, cloaked in silk and crowned with ceremony. But now, those same silks concealed knives, both literal and metaphorical. The palace walls were no longer protection. They were mirrors, reflecting her isolation. And behind them, behind every curtain and corridor, the whispers grew teeth. She will not stop. We must make her stop. The huntsmen were gathering. And the queen? She was still dancing, unaware that the floor beneath her feet was beginning to crack. The palace grew quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but a silence that buzzed just beneath the surface, like the pause before a storm. Servants spoke less. Doors creaked open slower. Footsteps echoed longer in the halls. Even the candles seemed to flicker with hesitation. Queen Gertrude remained, as always, composed. She still wore white, still walked tall, still touched her son's hair as he knelt to say his prayers. But she was no longer alone in the corridors. She was being watched. While King Andrew rode far to the east, battling in Galicia, plotting campaigns, securing trade routes, the wolves crept closer to his court. They did not come with swords drawn. They came with words, with alliances, with old grudges dressed in new language. Noble families, the Kakshiks, the Chaks, the Garagiei, men who had ruled Hungary before the foreign queen arrived, now found a common cause. They whispered to one another in antechambers and stables, under torches and behind monastery walls. What united them wasn't ideology. It wasn't even justice. It was something simpler. Resentment. They resented the way the court smelled now, of foreign oils and Bavarian incense. They resented the German tongue that echoed down the royal halls. They resented how Hungary's lands, titles, and bishoprics flowed like gold into hands that did not belong. And above all, they resented her, a woman in the king's place. To them, Gertrude was not just foreign. She was a usurper, not by force, but by presence, by how easily she filled the vacuum Andrew left behind. She was issuing edicts in his name, receiving ambassadors, and, most outrageously, granting lands from Hungary's treasury to her brothers without the consent of the Great Council. To these men, this wasn't governance. It was insult. A soft, elegant occupation of everything they believed was sacred. So they plotted. But this wasn't a sudden coup. It was a slow, tightening noose. They began isolating her, withdrawing their sons from service, stopping their wives from attending her events, refusing to bow as low at court, delaying responses to royal commands, letting her feel the void where power should have been. Gertrude, at first, did not flinch. She believed, perhaps naively, that she was still protected by her role, by her husband, by the church. She had God, her lineage, and her son. But none of those would be enough. Her most trusted advisors warned her in coded phrases. A bishop whispered that wolves roam closest when the king is away. A maid begged her not to walk alone after Vespers. Even her confessor asked if she had prepared her soul for the test of fire. But what could she do? To confront the nobles would be to admit weakness. To appeal to her husband, far away in war, might appear paranoid. To remove her brothers from power would mean betraying the very blood that made her queen. So she remained still, unmoving like a deer in snow, hoping silence would make them stop watching. But the wolves didn't just watch. They fed. They fed on public opinion. They fed on envy. They fed on a people starving under war taxes, watching foreigners feast in marble halls. Rumors spread like fever that the queen poisoned rivals, that she gave away Hungarian virgins to German lords, that she had a secret lover among the clergy. Lies, all of them. But truth doesn't matter when fire is already catching. Even the priests began to murmur that her family's hold over the church was unholy. A few called her the Jezebel of the Danube. Meanwhile, Gertrude clung to her routines, daily mass, letters to her sisters, walks with her children. She took care not to cry in public, took care to smile at those who scowled. But she knew. Each morning, the silence grew louder. Each evening, fewer ladies attended her chambers. And then came the breaking point. In 1213, news arrived that her brother, Berthold, had been granted even more land by the king's authority. Territory that once belonged to Hungarian war heroes now belonged to a Bavarian youth who spoke Magyar like a tourist. This wasn't just a slight. It was a spark. The nobles met in secret. Their plan was simple. Kill her, not in court, not with fanfare, but quickly, brutally, in a place where the world could not intervene. But until then, they would smile, they would kneel, they would raise their cups at the next feast, and she, unknowing, would sit beside them, bathed in candlelight, draped in silk, trusting the wolves in the room. History often marks its villains with blood, but sometimes history forgets how quietly the blades are drawn. In the grand halls of Esztergom, beneath gilded ceilings and portraits of saints, the queen still walked. But each step she took now echoed not with command, but with approaching footsteps. They were coming. And she was still smiling. The palace shimmered that night. Torches lined the stone corridors. Musicians tuned their lutes. The kitchen roasted whole boars, their skins crackling over flame, basted with honey and cloves. Wine from Dalmatia was poured into goblets lined with gold. In every corner of the great hall, laughter rose like incense. For once, the royal court seemed alive. Gertrude, radiant in a gown of pearl-dusted silk, sat at the center, her smile, measured, polite, reflected in the polished silverware before her. At her side, her son Bela, barely 5 years old, giggled as he reached for sweets with sticky fingers. Across from her, the nobles raised their cups. "To the queen," they said, and the knives beneath their robes did not tremble. It was meant to be a celebration. King Andrew II had returned victorious from a campaign in Haluch. Victory in war meant stability at court, or so it should have. But beneath the music, beneath the toasts and garlands, a different rhythm pulsed. The conspirators were present. The Kaksiks, the Geregi, the Banfis. They lined the feast with the same poise they once gave to kings. But tonight, their smiles were sharper than their blades. The plan had been simple: strike after the feast, in the forest, far from the sanctuary of stone walls, far from witnesses. They would wait until Gertrude left the table, until she passed the chapel on her way to her private chambers. And there, where moonlight broke through the trees, they would descend, not with a public execution, but with an erasure, a clean, brutal silence, a message written not in parchment, but in blood. Inside the hall, Gertrude was unaware. She leaned toward her son, brushed crumbs from his tunic. She raised a goblet, toasted the safe return of her husband. She laughed at a minstrel's joke, though not loudly. Queens do not laugh too loud. The music swelled. The nobles clapped. Plates were cleared. And in that moment, just for a moment, she seemed happy. A mother, a wife, a woman whose kingdom still responded to her voice. It was a dangerous illusion, because outside the horses were saddled. The assassins had checked their daggers. One even whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for aim. As the feast wound down, servants lit lanterns in the hallway. Gertrude rose to escort her son to his quarters. She kissed his forehead. He yawned, clutching her hand with the trust only children possess. But the wolves did not strike yet. They waited. It had to be isolated, surgical, undeniable. So they watched as she passed beneath the great stone arch, her silhouette framed by firelight. Her train swept across the marble like a whisper of snow, and she disappeared down the corridor, toward the private chapel. This was their moment. The men broke away, slipping out in twos and threes, their cloaks wrapped tight, their footsteps swift, silent, through servant halls, through cloisters, through the side doors they had memorized since youth. In the dark, the palace breathed. And in that breath, they moved. But here's what history forgets. Gertrude was not entirely blind. She had noticed the way the noble wives had stopped writing, the way the archbishop had paused too long before blessing her, the way the guards at her chamber door now looked more at each other than at her. She had felt it, like a chill under silks, like a dream where you know something's coming, but can't name it. Still, she chose to walk to the chapel that night. Still, she chose not to summon more guards. Still, she carried a small prayer book in her hands, pages worn with devotion. Maybe she believed in mercy. Maybe she believed that God would not let such a thing happen on holy ground. But history is indifferent, and men with power are not gods. They ambushed her just beyond the chapel steps. It wasn't theatrical. There were no words, only the sound of wood splintering, a bench leg torn from the altar, and the first blow across her shoulder sent her crashing against the stone. She screamed. The sound cut through the corridor, echoed off the walls like a bell no priest dared ring. One conspirator hesitated. Another pushed him aside. She tried to rise. Another blow landed across her back. Blood, royal blood, splattered the marble. But the wolves kept coming. Back in the hall, no one moved. A few heard something. A servant paused mid-step, but no alarm was raised. It was better, safer not to know. Gertrude's last vision was said to be of the moonlight, breaking through a high window. It shimmered on her blood. It turned red into silver. And then, darkness. When it was done, they dragged her body away. stripped her of crown and veil, threw her into the woods like hunted game. She had been queen. Now she was carrion. No funeral was announced. No bell was tolled. The court simply continued. The feast had ended, and the wolves had feasted too. Dawn did not come gently. The sun rose over Esztergom with a cold, colorless light, spreading across the river Danube like spilled milk. Birds sang as if nothing had happened. Servants swept the courtyards. Priests prepared for morning mass. The palace returned to its rhythm. But something was missing. Someone was missing, and no one dared to ask. Queen Gertrude's body lay in the woods, where the assassins had discarded it, half covered in leaves and mud, her gown torn, soaked in blood, her hair matted with soil. A crownless corpse. Not even the wolves of the forest dared approach her. Perhaps they too sensed the blasphemy. The noblemen who had struck her down returned to court in silence. Their hands were stained, but their expressions clean. Some even slept peacefully that night. No official report was made. No one recorded the hour of her death. No priest was summoned to anoint her. There was no royal decree, no mourning clothes, no proclamation, just silence. Later that day, a group of servants sent to search discreetly found her. They were ordered not to speak. Her body was lifted in secret, wrapped in rough cloth like a criminal, and moved under cover of dusk. There are conflicting reports about what happened next. Some say her body was hidden in a convent crypt without rites to avoid public unrest. Others claim it was dismembered further, piece by piece, by the same men who had slain her, either to destroy evidence or as a final act of dominance. A few versions, whispered by peasants, say that her tongue was cut out, so her spirit could not curse them from beyond. That her eyes were gouged, so she could not haunt them with her gaze. None of this is written in official chronicles. But then again, neither is her death. Modern scholars debate the true nature of her murder. But forensic logic offers some clarity. A woman of her status, struck repeatedly with blunt instruments, would likely have suffered. Cranial trauma. Massive skull fractures leading to intracranial bleeding. Spinal rupture, consistent with being beaten while prone. Lacerations, both defensive, forearms, and offensive, torso, indicating a struggle. Pulmonary collapse or exsanguination, death from shock or blood loss. Some speculate she may not have died instantly, that she may have crawled for a time, that her fingers were found bloodied, soil trapped under her nails. There's no way to prove it. But the thought lingers, like a wound that never closes. What if she died knowing that no one would come, and yet, even in death, her humiliation was not complete? When her body was finally returned, days later, to the palace grounds, the court refused to hold a full funeral. Andrew II, her husband, did nothing. No public statement, no punishment, no decree of mourning. He attended no mass, issued no arrest, ordered no retaliation. Whether he feared rebellion, or whether he had silently approved the act, no one knows. But the message was clear. Gertrude of Merania was dead, and the court would move on. But Hungary would not rest so easily. Among the people, rumors turned to fear. Some claimed her ghost had been seen walking the riverbank, weeping without eyes. Others heard a woman's voice calling for her son at midnight, echoing through pine groves. In the villages, peasants left offerings on church steps. Scraps of bread, broken rings, tiny veils. For the queen who died without a candle. Priests warned against superstition, but even they began to light extra incense when passing the woods. Years later, chroniclers would attempt to stitch a cleaner version of her death. Some omitted it altogether. Others painted it as a political misstep, a moment of unfortunate unrest, rectified by divine justice in later reigns. But folklore remembered what politics erased. Gertrude became something else. Not a queen, not a woman, but a warning. The white swan, hunted and broken, her feathers stained red. The forest bride, whose crown was devoured by wolves. The foreigner who dared to rule, and was punished without mercy. It would be years before her remains were moved to a proper resting place. Years before prayers were said in her name. Years before even a single stone marked the place where a queen had fallen. And even then, it was done in whispers, in the quiet. Like everything else in her death, what had started as court politics had ended in something far more primal. This was not justice. This was sacrifice. A queen offered not to God, but to fear, to xenophobia, to masculine pride. Hungary, they believed, had been cleansed. But history would remember, because even buried without a crown, without a voice, without a body whole, Gertrude still haunted. Not as a ghost with chains and shrieks, but as a silence too loud to ignore. The king returned to a palace missing its queen. Andrew II rode into Esztergom not as a grieving husband, but as a ruler coming home from war. Dust on his boots, triumph in his eyes, unaware, or perhaps already informed, of what had unfolded in his absence. The courtiers met him with bows, the nobles with guarded nods, and the servants with silence. No one said her name. No one mentioned the blood still faintly staining the chapel floor. No one dared to speak of Gertrude. And the king? He said nothing. The official version was vague. Her Majesty passed suddenly, a tragic incident, unforeseen. There would be no formal inquest, no list of suspects, no arrests. There were rumors that Andrew knew, that he had received word on campaign and had chosen not to rush back, that he had calculated the risk of intervening and decided silence was the cheaper price, because speaking her name meant confronting his own court's betrayal. Punishing them would mean civil war. And Andrew, already mired in debt and foreign conflict, needed the nobles more than he had ever needed his wife. So he turned inward. He retreated into the architecture of denial. In the days following her death, the palace grew hollow. The queen's chambers were sealed, her tapestries removed, her portraits taken down, her German attendants dismissed. It was as though she had never existed. No bells tolled across Hungary. No national day of mourning was declared. No masses ordered from Rome. Even her son, young Bela, was kept from asking too many questions. Some say the boy cried in the corridors, clutching a ribbon that had once been tied in her hair. Others claim he whispered to statues in the garden, asking them if his mother still breathed beneath the earth. But the statues, like the king, remained stone. Those who loved her, few though they were, grieved in secret. One nun at the convent near Pannonhalma wrote in a hidden diary, "We pray for the queen who died alone, who served the altar but found no priest. Her name we whisper only in the dark." Her sister, Hedwig of Silesia, begged Andrew to restore her body, to grant her a tomb. Andrew delayed. Months passed, then a year. No tomb was raised. Her body remained buried without blessing. Her memory like her flesh, left to decay. This was the true execution, not the one with wood and iron, but the one with paper and ink. The court scribes redacted her presence. The chronicles skipped over her reign. Letters from Rome grew cold in tone. All traces of her rulership were buried beneath layers of bureaucratic dust. Her name appeared only when necessary: Gertrudis Regina, a footnote, a birth record, a signature on an old land grant. She was once Queen of Hungary. But in death, she became a rumor. And yet, silence is never neutral. Among the people, it was taken as cowardice. Among the nobles, it was taken as permission. Among the church, it was taken as shame. The nobility learned they could act without consequence, so long as they framed it as for the kingdom. The court learned that a queen's blood could be spilled without scandal, so long as it did not stain the throne directly. And the people learned to fear, not just their rulers, but the space where rulers should have spoken. Behind closed doors, Andrew II was not untouched. Some say he stopped speaking Gertrude's name not out of coldness, but out of guilt, that he prayed for her in secret, that he wore her ring beneath his glove, that he once whispered in Latin at her unmarked grave, "I did not protect you. Forgive me." But public grief is what defines a king, and Andrew offered none. Instead, he remarried, took a new wife, Yolande de Courtenay, within 2 years. And when he did, he ordered a fresh coronation. New silks, new crown, new hymns. It was meant to wipe clean the past, but nothing truly vanishes beneath stone. Bela, Gertrude's son, grew quiet after her death, withdrawn, watchful. He spoke less, slept little. And when he became King Bela IV, years later, one of Hungary's strongest rulers, he never once referred to his mother in court records. But he also never forgot. He would later order the construction of abbeys in her name. He would secretly have masses said for her soul. He would surround himself with advisors who feared silence more than noise. Perhaps he understood that a realm built on forgetting cannot last. That what had been done to his mother was not just a family tragedy, but a national sin. In the end, silence did not protect Andrew. His reign unraveled. His policies collapsed. The kingdom fractured. And as the nobles turned on him, one by one, perhaps he recalled the feast, the candles, the men who smiled, and the woman beside him who had thought she was safe. He had been silent then, and now no one spoke for him. Gertrude had died without a crown, but the throne had died with her voice, and Hungary would never quite cleanse the stain she left behind. Not a stain of treason, but of silence. Her bones lay untouched for years, buried not in a royal crypt, nor beneath cathedral stone, but somewhere far from light. Perhaps in the unmarked soil of a convent, perhaps in the damp earth near the palace woods where her blood had first spilled. There was no gravestone, no carved inscription, only dirt, only silence. And yet, silence does not last forever. Far to the northwest, in the land of Silesia, a woman heard the silence and answered it with prayer. Her name was Hedwig, younger sister to Gertrude, a duchess, a widow, a holy woman, and one day, a saint. Saint Hedwig of Silesia had always been the gentlest of the Meranian daughters. Where Gertrude moved through court like a queen, Hedwig moved through the world like a nun. Barefoot in snow, wrapped in humility, speaking little, praying often. But when she learned of Gertrude's death, not the official tale, but the truth whispered by passing monks and frightened travelers, something shifted. For the first time, Hedwig broke her vows of stillness. She wrote to Hungary. She wrote to Andrew II. She wrote to Rome. She begged, not for revenge, but for dignity. "Let her be buried in hallowed ground," she wrote. "Let her soul rest beneath a stone that bears her name. Let the sin be ended." For years, no reply came. But Hedwig did not stop. She fasted for Gertrude. She offered masses for her sister's soul. She whispered her name during matins, her voice shaking not with grief, but with fury born of faith. And slowly, the world shifted. The church, long silent, began to murmur. The tale of the queen who died without rites circulated among abbots. Some priests spoke of her as a martyr, not for religion, but for foreignness, for power, for being a woman in a man's world. Pilgrims began to visit the woods near Esztergom, leaving small tokens: white cloth, pebbles shaped like crowns, a single black ribbon tied to a tree. The people had not forgotten. They had simply been waiting for someone to speak first. Andrew II, aging, weakened, perhaps guilt-worn, finally relented. In the 7th year after her death, a quiet order was issued. Gertrude's remains were to be exhumed and moved to the Cistercian Abbey at Pilis, a monastery she had once patronized, nestled among pine forests and fog. There would be no public ceremony, no royal pardon, no list of names responsible, just a reburial, a stone, and a whispered mass at dawn. But to Hedwig, it was enough. She traveled herself to Hungary, frail, veiled, walking slowly. The nobles bowed, awkward and silent, unsure whether to greet her as duchess, as widow, or as vengeance. She brought with her a single cross, carved from wood, said to have been blessed by a monk from Assisi. She placed it at her sister's new tomb. She said nothing. But her tears, witnesses claimed, were the first tears shed aloud for the queen in public since her murder. In the years to come, the tomb became a place of pilgrimage, not grand, not royal, but honest. Folk prayers painted Gertrude as a protector of women, of foreigners, of the voiceless. They called her the Silent Queen, the one who ruled without revenge, who died without curses, who waited for her name to be spoken again, not in judgment, but in mercy. But not all remembered her kindly. In court, nobles continued to omit her from records. Some claimed she had been power-hungry. Others repeated the old lies, that she had betrayed Hungary, that she had drained the kingdom's coffers, that her murder was political necessity. Yet those same nobles died in turn. Their names faded, and hers remained, carved into stone, whispered in cloisters, painted in chapels as a woman in white robes, eyes turned upward. Meanwhile, Hedwig grew old. She never returned to royal life. She lived in a convent, walked barefoot into old age, and died surrounded by nuns. She was canonized in 1267, her miracles recorded, her name sung, and in the corner of her hagiography, just a line: she secured rest for her sister, Queen Gertrude, who died unjustly. That line remains today, in Latin, etched into the walls of churches across Poland and Hungary. A final act of love, a final act of resistance. But love and sainthood did not erase the cost. Gertrude's death had rippled through Hungary. The nobility, empowered by Andrew's silence, grew bolder. Factions deepened, feuds intensified. The royal family splintered. Wars returned. And within decades, the Mongol invasions would devastate the land Gertrude had once tried to stabilize. Some blamed the king. Some blamed foreign influence. Some, in whispers, said it was the ghost of the queen, unsettled, calling down judgment on a land that had spilled blood on holy ground. Even in death, her presence lingered, not as a queen on coins, not as a name in gilded manuscripts, but as a question. What happens when a kingdom kills its own mother? And that question, posed by saints, scholars, and peasants, never found a clean answer. Only prayers and bones, buried at last beneath stone, where silence could no longer speak louder than memory. History rarely speaks kindly of inconvenient women, and Gertrude of Merania was nothing if not inconvenient. For her time, her court, and the men who ruled alongside her, she was powerful without apology, graceful without submission, foreign in a land that worshipped bloodlines, and queen in more than just name. But was she ahead of her time, or simply alone in it? Centuries have passed since her body was dragged from the altar, but the debate still lingers. Some historians label her a meddler, a queen who overstepped, who placed her German kin in Hungarian positions of power, who sowed distrust through favoritism and entitlement. Others argue she was a scapegoat, targeted not for what she did, but for what she represented: change, womanhood, and a shift in power that threatened male aristocracy. The truth, as always, lies in the gray. In court documents that survived, charters, decrees, letters, Gertrude appears as a competent administrator. She issued land grants not just to Germans, but to Hungarian abbeys. She financed hospitals, repaired roads, commissioned religious artworks. She wrote to bishops about church reforms. She consulted with diplomats. There is no record of tyranny, no evidence of cruelty, only silence. And silence is not guilt. So why then was she so hated? It comes down to three things. 1, her foreign blood. In a kingdom struggling with identity, a queen who brought German customs, German voices, and German ambition felt like a slow invasion. 2, her confidence. Gertrude did not play coy. She ruled in her husband's absence. She stood at council meetings. She made decisions. 3, her gender. Had a foreign man ruled Hungary with such decisiveness, perhaps he would have been called a strategist. But Gertrude was a woman, and power in her hands felt unnatural to the men around her. She wasn't born in the wrong century. She was born in the wrong company. Even her portraits, those that remain in forgotten monasteries, are telling. In one, she stands with her hand on a gospel and a crown half fallen from her head. In another, she is seated on a throne with her eyes not gazing forward, but down, as if she knew where history would eventually place her. There's a tenderness in those images, but also a question. Not who was this queen, but why was this queen so dangerous? Some feminist scholars today look to Gertrude as a proto-icon of female governance. Not a warrior queen, not a seductress, not a saint, but a woman who managed, negotiated, and acted in a time when women were expected to obey, ornament, and bear heirs. In this way, she was subversive without scandal, And that made her even more threatening, because she didn't break rules loudly. She simply lived as if the rules didn't apply. Others push back. They point out that her power came not from merit, but from marriage. That her appointments of family were blatant nepotism, not political strategy. That she never bothered to learn Hungarian or to engage meaningfully with native customs. But even this criticism reveals something deeper: expectation. No one asked King Andrew to be sensitive to German tradition. No one expected him to speak his queen's language. But Gertrude? She was meant to bend, to blend, to disappear behind her husband's shadow. She didn't. And that, more than anything, sealed her fate. What remains of her legacy? A few crumbling stones at Pilis Abbey, a handful of footnotes in Hungarian royal annals, a line in St. Hedwig's hagiography. But perhaps the truest legacy lies in how she is remembered, not by governments, but by stories. In Hungarian folklore, she became the White Lady of the Forest, a ghost who walks the trees at dusk, searching for her child, weeping for justice never granted. In Bavarian legends, she is remembered as the broken dove, sent east and shattered by wolves. And in modern reinterpretations, she is often cast as the forgotten mother, whose silence birthed a king and whose death shaped a kingdom's descent. Was she ahead of her time? Perhaps. She envisioned a court connected to Rome and Bavaria, not isolated. She brought theological and artistic ideas Hungary had not seen. She acted as regent in a time when women were not meant to rule at all. But her tragedy lies not in her vision. It lies in her isolation. Because vision without allies becomes danger. And Gertrude had no one left at her side when the knives came out. She was not a saint. She was not a tyrant. She was not a symbol. Not then. She was a woman. In silk, in power. In the wrong place, at the wrong time. With no one left to speak when they came for her. And in the end, history didn't know what to do with her. So it tried to forget. But forgetting is never complete. Not when the silence she left behind still echoes in the stones of a kingdom that once called her queen. They didn't just kill her. They tore her from sanctuary, silenced her name, stripped her from the scrolls of kings and the prayers of priests. They buried her body. Then they buried her story. And yet centuries later, here we are, speaking her name again, Gertrude of Merania. Not as a queen in glory, not as a legend carved in marble, but as a woman who dared to exist too powerfully in a world that only allowed women to be silent, soft, and still. She wasn't a tyrant. She wasn't a saint. She was a figure trapped between roles. A queen expected to reign without ruling, a foreigner expected to serve without asking, a mother expected to die without consequence. And when she didn't meet those expectations, they hunted her. What makes her story so haunting is not how it ended. It's how familiar it still feels. A woman climbs into a space reserved for men. She's called ambitious, then arrogant, then dangerous when her presence disrupts the comfort of power. The knives come out, sometimes literal, more often rhetorical. The method changes. The pattern does not. And when the damage is done, silence falls. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying something means admitting complicity. So they called her foreign. They called her proud. They called her unfit. But they never called her what she truly was. A woman doing what she was never supposed to be allowed to do. And doing it too well. And that terrified them. But beyond the tragedy, beyond the politics, beyond the horror of how she died, there is a deeper lesson. That silence is not always peace. That forgetting is not always healing. And that history, when written only by the victors, becomes a weapon just as sharp as the blade that ended her life. Gertrude's story is not just a medieval murder, it's a mirror. A reminder that power without accountability breeds cruelty. That difference becomes danger when fear is left to fester. And that even in the halls of palaces, human lives are fragile when truth is treated as optional. But perhaps what hurts most in her story is not how they killed her. It's how no one stood up. Not her husband, not her court, not her church, not even her own kingdom. She died surrounded by people who once bowed before her, but who, when the moment came, chose safety over justice. And that silence, more than the dagger, more than the bench leg, more than the forest floor, was what truly destroyed her. Centuries later, her sister Hedwig would pray her name back into history. A monastery would raise a stone. A saint would light a candle. But it should not have taken a saint to remind the world that a queen deserves to die with dignity. So what remains? A broken crown? A forgotten grave? If a woman can be hunted for ruling too boldly, then who is safe when the world decides one voice is too loud? When the ones with power choose silence, who then will speak for the dead?